ORF Sound.
Im Gespräch.
He is regarded as one of the most original interpreters of contemporary world affairs. He advises heads of states and governments across Europe, has met Vladimir Putin, writes regular columns for the Financial Times and the New York Times, and is the author of internationally acclaimed books and essays. The political scientist Ivan Krastev was born in Bulgaria in 1965 and has lived in Vienna for many years. He is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, where he is currently serving as interim rector. He was one of the founding members of the European Council of Foreign Relations and chairs the Center for Liberal Stategies in Sofia. I sat down with Ivan Krastev to discuss the war in Ukraine, Putin, Trump, demography, politics as a delivery service, and the future of liberal democracy. Ivan Krastev, I have a quite modest goal for our conversation today. By the end of it, I'd like to understand the world a little better and Europe. Can you help me do that?
With great pleasure, because I'm going to help myself, because to be honest, I'm not sure that I understand it anyway.
In recent years, a line from Shakespeare's Hamlet has been quoted again and again. The time is out of joint, because it seems to capture a feeling that many people seem to share. And you are very often asked to explain this time, from leading newspapers like the New York Times to heads of government, and now by me. But why you exactly? How do you know what has gone wrong and how?
Listen, in a certain way, you can have the comic answer. I'm coming from a country which has probably more fortune tellers per capita than any other place in the world, so probably this is one of the reasons. But secondly, if we talk much more seriously, I don't believe this is so much about my personality. It is very much about the fact that I'm part of a generation that has a radical change in our personal biography. This is different than basically knowing things. This is basically going through an experience which probably is relevant to make sense of a world which is really changing dramatically in front of our eyes. And you should try to imagine how fast the world is changing for a 24, 25-year-old Bulgarian in 1989. This is the speed of change. The fact that on Friday you cannot believe anymore what you have been thinking on Monday. The idea that basically some of the major assumptions on which the world have been functioning has been challenged. I believe that this creates some type of an advantage when you ask people to talk about the world that is dramatically changing. And this is probably one of the reasons why people are interested to listen to somebody like me.
So let's draw on this experience. In a widely discussed speech in Davos this year, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said, "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition." What is it that is breaking apart or has already broken apart?
Listen, I believe that it is a really much deeper kind of a rupture than normally people are discussing in Davos, because Mark Carney, and this was one of those speeches that is capturing the zeitgeist, at the time was talking about the breaking of international order in the way it was known after 1945 and particularly after 1989. But I do believe we're going to something which is much deeper. And there is a short science fiction story which is called When We Went to See the End of the World. And it tells the time in which suddenly people had traveled in time. So the tourist agencies started to offer the possibility that you can go and witness the end of the world. And told the short stories about a dinner party in which people are coming and sharing their experiences. And there are two things happening. First of all, they went to see the end of the world, but they saw different things. One see the world freezing, the other see basically the world going under the water, the third saw the world burning out. But while they're talking about all this, On the television, there was reports of president being killed, of major riots on the city. So in a certain way, the end of the world was coming in front of their eyes, but there was so much kind of busy to try to see it. I'm saying this because, in my view, one of the things that happened, and probably it's the West, not everywhere else, is that this feeling that you're living in a kind of the end times, this kind of disappearance of a positive future, from our perspective of the world, is something that I found the most important. And this is what basically, in my view, Carney meant when he said it is a rupture, not a transition. Transition is a movement from one stage to another. But this next stage, you can describe it. You can like or dislike, but you know basically how the next destination is going to look like. Why we see that something is ending, but it is not very clear what is beginning. And I do believe this is at the heart of it, and this is why, at least for me, if you're going to ask me not how I understand the world, but how I feel the world, it's very much like a vertigo. Kundera has a great definition of vertigo. He said, vertigo is not the fear of falling. Vertigo is the desire to jump, against which you're struggling.
But why would we have the desire to jump?
One is because everything is changing and we don't understand. The life as we know it is not there anymore. And it's not only politics. By the way, people, I believe historians, are going to come back in 10, 15 years. And they're going to write much more about the effect of COVID and what happened in March and April 2020, when suddenly, for weeks, the world was frozen. Because this dramatically changed our imagination. Imagine something that you believe is impossible became possible. And as a result of it, your political imagination is changed. For example, imagine that you are an environmental activist. And all your life you wanted all the planes to land in the same day. And they landed. Or if you're a right-wing activist and it was your dream that all borders are going to be closed on the same day. You were dreaming about this, but you believed that this was not possible. And this was possible. They were closed on the same day, all over the world. And I do believe this idea that certain thing that was impossible happened is changing very much the way we see the world, the way we understand ourselves, and not simply because of the pandemic. But suddenly, the idea that impossible can happen starts to go on every way of life. For example, if you look today and read the newspapers, there is no connection between the economy section, market section, and the political section. If you see the performance of the American market, you're going to imagine that this is the most optimistic kind of world in which we are living. The stocks are going up, people are making incredible profits. If you try and see the political sections, you're going to see that the world is going to die every minute. It's going to be either climate or nuclear war or something else. When you see how people feel, they feel totally disoriented, at least in the West. And I do believe this fact, this kind of totally disconnect between different parts of our life. Quite often people say, I feel personally okay, but I'm very much worried, for example, about my kids, how they're going to live. I'm much more worried about how society is going to look like. And my major argument, and on this I could be very much wrong, but I do believe that two things that were very much structuring our world on a deeper level has changed. One is we always knew that people are mortal. We didn't like it, but we have been living with this, and basically dealing with our mortality is what produced our civilization. Now you go to Silicon Valley and you're going to see all these people who genuinely believe that they will never die. So they want to live forever, but not to live forever in the memory of the people, but in their apartments. And on the other side, we believe that we are mortal, but we believe that there are certain things that are immortal. For example, our nation. I'm going to die, but basically I'm going to be remembered and so on. And this has changed. And by the way, the fact that you're going to have much more people who do not have children is also affecting this, because you see the world differently. So the mortality of nations and the possibility of the immortal individual, this is a structural change. And then you have everything else. AI, I was very much impressed by a conversation that Ezra Klein has with Harari, in which Harari made a point which is not new, but in my view is important. He said, AI is not an instrument. It is an agent. All our other technological discoveries historically have been instruments, things that are helping us to do things differently. But now you have an agent, and this agent is in a totally different relations with us. And in a certain way, you have the feeling that you're invaded from everywhere. Some people believe that they're invaded by migrants, others they fear that they're invaded by machines. But in a certain way, the world as we knew it is not there anymore. And I do believe this is behind everything. Politics, economics, people have a different fears, people have a different dreams, but this sense of rupture is what, in my view, Carney has captured.
But on the other hand, the experience that the impossible is suddenly possible could give you hope and optimism, and not the sense of vertigo and the wish to jump.
The things that we fear most are the things that we hope for. And AI is the best example of this. On one level, AI can create really miracles when it comes to medicine, when it comes to economy. So there are people who hope. But this is, in my view, a characteristics of our time. The things that we are most hoping for and the thing that we most fear for is the same thing. It is not that the evil is going to prevail over the good. In a strange way, the evil and the good is the same thing. The AI, if it is going to realize its potential and help humanity, this is our best hope. On the other side, if it is going to change human nature, if it is going to make humanity kind of useless, if basically it's going to destroy the distinctiveness of individual, this is something that, of course, you cannot not fear because this is your species. And I have seen this before on a lower level. The same was with opening of the borders. You go in Eastern Europe, you ask people, what is the best thing that happened to you after 1989? And they say, opening of the borders. What is the thing that scares you most? Opening of the borders. Because opening of the borders means that I can get out, I can have an opportunities that I didn't have before, but opening of the borders means that other people can come and probably are not going to be as happy. So this kind of the best and the worst being the same thing and you don't know in which direction it will go, in my view, is a distinctive characteristics of the time in which we are living.
You mentioned the pandemic now, and you mentioned AI as causes for this rupture. You didn't mention the war in Ukraine, but still you said in several interviews that it was the Russian invasion into the Ukraine which actually ended the 20th century. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. Listen, it is critically important because any big war is a major change. And in the case of Russia-Ukraine, this is a big war between two big states. The number of shells, and even I'm not counting drones that have been basically fired, last year was on the level of 1942. So we're talking about something big and 1,000 people dying. But also I do believe that the Russia-Ukrainian war was the end of the 20th century because suddenly all the identities that have been created in the 20th century disappeared. Europe was very much based not on a certain vision of the future, but on a kind of rejections of a certain past. Because what kept Europeans together was the common experience of the destruction of the both World Wars, and particularly World War II. And now what happened with the Russia's war in Ukraine is that first, the shared experience have been totally destroyed. When the Russians start talking that they're there to denazify Ukraine, all the kind of talk about the common understanding of Nazism become totally meaningless. You are weaponizing something that was so central for the Europe's understanding of its history for totally instrumental reasons, try to explain the war that otherwise you cannot explain. Secondly, which in my view is also changing dramatically, and we're seeing this more and more, you cannot distinguish anymore if you're basically a drone operator between a war and a video game. This is dramatic. This is the easiness of killing. One of the things that I really believe people are not realizing is that to a certain extent this war was not simply an imperial war, it was very much in demography. President Putin is totally obsessed with demography. There is not enough Russians in the world. By the way, as you know, he's quite obsessed with his own kind of longevity. 26 billion is an anti-aging industry in Russia. And as a result of it, suddenly you end up of time in which history is totally deprived of its major characteristics. In a certain way, you're destroying Kiev and Kharkiv. And at the end of the World War II, the consensus was that this should not happen ever again, and you're doing this and trying to pretend that you're fighting the Nazi. So we don't have a language anymore to talk about this. And the other thing that is happening, and in my view, after the World War II, there were 4 countries that were very exceptional. And we all agree that they were exceptional. It was not the exceptionality that everybody believes about themselves. It was the Soviet and the Americans, and this was the Germans and the Israelis. Because Soviets and the Americans were basically the 2 ideological states that framed the Cold War and very much was about the future and to whom the world belongs. Soviet Union disappeared, but also the American Cold War identity is over. In a certain way, President Trump made it very clear that he believes that liberalism is not the strength but the vulnerability of the United States. And Israel, in the eyes of many people, particularly outside of the West, stopped to be perceived as the victim and very much was perceived as somebody who is acting in the way that is totally unacceptable. And then you have Germany. Every crisis that happens is becoming the crisis of the Germans' World War II identity. It was so difficult for the Germans to imagine German tanks on the territory of the former Soviet Union. It was very difficult for the Germans to talk about the war in Gaza. It was so difficult for the Germans to talk about their disagreement with the United States, because all this what Germany was about. And I'm saying this because we're in a period in which all major identities that have been built in the 20th century are not there anymore. And all the major lessons that we have learned from the 20th century suddenly starts to look irrelevant.
But did this have to happen? Like for a long time, historians moved away from the idea of the great man theory, according to which a couple of very powerful individuals determined the course of history. Instead, they pointed to long-term structures and developments. But would the world really look the way it does today, and as you just described it, if, let's say, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump had chosen different professional careers?
It is very interesting because in Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, on the last page, Donald Trump appears. And basically, the major argument of Fukuyama is it going to be enough for people like Trump, who back then was a kind of a business celebrity, to have his ambition for recognition satisfied simply of being a rich man and being TV personality? And it turned out that the answer was not.
And Fukuyama's argument was people will get bored.
Exactly. But in a certain way, they get bored, they get overexcited. And one of the interesting things, particularly when you're talking about people like Trump and Putin, is that normally political scientists try to see most the similarity in them. But there is one important dissimilarity, and this is the understanding of time. If you listen to President Trump, the longest future that he talks about is several weeks. He's going to stop the war in Ukraine in a day, if you remember. And then basically when he's negotiating with the Iranians, everything is about 2 weeks, 4 weeks. If you listen to President Putin, everything is in centuries. He'll go and, by the way, read something from the 9th century in order to basically write an essay of what he's going to do in the 21st century. Suddenly, on one level, you have this narcissistic idea of time when nothing before you matters and nothing after you matters. And on the other, you have this political leader who basically lives in a total eternity, where in a certain way there is no history, because if the 9th century is as important for shaping your decision as what is happening to your society now, something is also wrong. And I do believe this kind of a collapse of a common understanding of time is something that is really interesting. And by the way, this has something to do with demography. It has something to do with the fact that we have this major collapse of the birth rates everywhere. Democratic countries and authoritarian countries, China, for example. And then you have rich countries and poor countries. And nobody knows now exactly how it happened. There is a theory of a demographic transition, and it is well known, and it is very much about the education of women and other things. But now you expect a country like Finland, which has a generous social policy, very egalitarian place, women are really respected. Suddenly, overnight, they're losing a lot. Simply, basically, they don't have children. And Turkey, which collapsed over 2 or 3 years. And the fear that you don't understand why people do not want to reproduce themselves is a major issue in such a different places, in such a different environments. And by the way, this is the individual choices of people. You cannot blame people for taking one or the other decisions, but why? And in my view, this is one of the paradox also is the AI. AI can solve a lot of problems that can be solved before. But AI and, for example, big data, they're never answering the question why.
But let me come back to my original question. How big is the role of an individual politician in these days? Would the world look different without Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump? I mean, the war in Ukraine probably wouldn't have happened, or would it?
Yeah, listen, I also believe that people matter. People matter with their experiences. People matter also because in a moment of crisis, it's much easier to trust a person than an institution. There's going to be a certain type of a structural change, even without these personalities. But it could have a totally different shape. And yeah, individuals matters. I have been thinking quite a lot, particularly about President Putin. And for me, the most important part of his experience is not even so much the KGB background, which for sure is important, but the fact that he was outside of his country when his country was changing. During the perestroika, he was a Soviet spy in East Germany. So you cannot imagine how difficult it is to understand your own society if you are not there when the society goes under dramatic change. You know some people, and then you read in the papers, they're saying things that you don't expect from them at all. So as a result for him, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a mystery. He cannot understand why it happened. For him, this was a conspiracy. It was a betrayal. He didn't understand why all these other KGB officers didn't try to do something more to protect the country. He didn't understand why nobody committed a suicide after the project collapsed. So in a certain way, he was not understanding what happened to his country. And then out of his anxiety, he basically, of not understanding what happened with the Soviet Union, he starts to basically try to make his view of the world.
But is his aim now to rebuild the Soviet Union?
No. This idea that you want simply to rebuild the Soviet Union is not true. If you listen to his famous speech, and the most famous of his speech is not the day when he attacked Kiev, but 2 days earlier when he recognized the separatist republics, this was not a speech of a red colonel. This was a speech of a white general. He was talking that Soviet Union is to be blamed for the state in which the Russians are. He was calling Ukraine a state basically created by Lenin and populated by Nazi. He was very much kind of obsessed with the survival of the Russian civilization, and he's thinking very much in a civilizational terms. But this is not about Soviet Union or communism. This is about Russia and Russia's view in the world. He has this famous quote, "If there is no Russia in the world, this world has no meaning to exist." And then the problem is, what was the major threat to the Russia as a civilization in his view? And paradoxically, there are 3 things. One was, of course, the military threat that he likes to talk about, NATO and so on. We don't know how much he believes it. Russia is a nuclear power. So from this point of view, the idea that you can feel so threatened being a major nuclear power does not come easily, particularly for those of us who are not a nuclear power. But of course, he has seen the nuclear power collapsing, the Soviet Union. And this is why he didn't understand how it could happen. Secondly, it was about Russia's identity. And then, of course, one of the important things is his problem with the children. What is happening to our children? There is a famous American TV show, which is called The Americans. It was very famous in the US. It is a classical spy Cold War novel. It happens in the late 1980s. 2 Soviet spies being illegals in the US. They're staying there for decades, they have kids and so on. The story is that when they had to go home, their kids didn't go home because their kids were Americans. These kids basically stayed in the United States while the parents had to go home in order to escape being arrested. I had the feeling that Putin has this fear that suddenly all Russian kids became Americans. They were totally westernized. This is, by the way, also very much the experience of the Russian elite who sent their children to the private schools in places like London or Vienna, and then suddenly they don't recognize their kids. And not because when they talk about democracy, but it was about social things, gay rights, and so on and so on. So our kids are not our kids. And secondly, Ukrainian kids are our kids because the Ukrainians are Russians. Nobody can understand the meaning of this war if it does not get the idea of the kidnapping and the abduction of the kids and the adoption of these kids. Nobody is going to understand Putin's relations to the West if he does not realize that the first openly anti-Western legislation which was adopted in Russia was the famous Dima Yakovlev law, which bans Americans from adopting Russian orphans. I do believe this idea of the kids, this fear of they're going to be world with no Russia or Russians, became critical for him. So before the war in 2021, on several occasions, without being asked, he was talking that, according to the demographic projections, there should have been 500 million Russians in the world, but because of the World War II, because of the Civil War, because of this, because of that, now there are only 143 million. So this idea that there is not enough Russians of the world means that Ukrainians should be Russians, Belarusians should be Russians. And this is why this war is very different from, for example, the Yugoslav wars, where you're trying basically to kill the children of others because you're afraid that otherwise they're going to revenge of killing their parents. Now you want to adopt the kids of the others.
Not long after the start of this war, in February 22, we did an interview together. And at the time you said the war would certainly not end before the American presidential election in November 24. Back then, this was still more than 2 years away. And I found your prediction extraordinarily pessimistic. Now it's mid-26, and this war has been going on for 4 years now. Will it ever end?
It is going to exhaust itself, but the major story is what is going to end. I do believe that at some point there are going to be certain type of freezing of the conflict, there's certain type of a ceasing of hostilities, but the end of fighting is not peace. And this is one of the major things that is happening, is that both sides are very much exhausted. I mean, demographically, this is also true for Ukraine, dramatically. For every baby being born in Ukraine, 3 persons are dying. They're exhausted economically, but also psychologically. You know, this war is longer than the Soviet Nazi war. And suddenly people have forgotten what it means to live in peace. You're going to have, in my view, certain escalation in the next months because the Russians will try to make one more effort to break the Ukrainian defenses. At least of what we get from the battlefield, it's not going to work. And then I will not be surprised that in autumn or the beginning of the winter, there could be some ceasefire for different reasons. Both sides can decide to do it. But how stable is going to be this ceasefire? How much this is going to create the sense of peace on both sides is a totally different question. And honestly, for President Putin, this is becoming now very personal. There was an interesting article in The Economist, anonymous article written by a former very senior Russian official who said something that I found believable, because this is also what I'm hearing from Russia too. Suddenly Russian elite starts to talk about the war as his war. It does not mean that they don't want Russia to win. It does not mean that basically they ain't, but some of them want it to finish regardless of how. Others want basically the Russia to go much more destructive and to try to win, regardless of how much it's going to cost its in reputation. But we're in a situation in which nobody is happy with President Putin. It does not mean that they're going to be a coup. And to be honest, I always get very ironic when the Western newspapers basically start talking about the coup or about his health as if we know something. But the story is there is alienation from the war. And it cannot go this for a long time. Because one of the things that people are normally not realizing was that Russians were more surprised by the war than many in the West. By the way, Russian elites were not prepared for this war. A big part of the Russian elites, particularly financial elites, believed that it was just bluffing, that he's trying to push on the West to get certain things. So when the war started, the first 1 month, the Russian situation was totally disorientation. And then they were mobilized, and then suddenly they sided with their country, and this was my country, right or wrong. And some of them basically didn't also have the feeling that they have much of an option, because many of these elites have been sanctioned by us. But then the first 2 years, and this is interesting, and very few people know about this, suddenly economically, these first 2 years of the war were not bad for the Russian businesses, including small and medium-sized businesses. First, because the Western company disappeared, so there was a market. But secondly, because Putin was so much afraid of the impact of the sanctions that he told the tax inspectors, stop going to the companies, which means that corruption pressure was dramatically reduced, because in Russia, when the tax inspector comes to your company, you're going to pay. And then for 2 years, there was this kind of excitement on the business side. We're not doing badly, we're doing fine. And of course, they have incredibly competent central bank, which helped them very much to deal with this first part. All this ended 2 years ago. Now the budget deficit's a real issue. The pressure on the company is big. Redistribution of property in Russia is amazing. The day when the war is over, we are not going to know the names of the 10 richest persons in Russia. All these names that we knew from before, including names, in my view, of some of the personal friends of President Putin, probably are not going to end up on the top 10, because there is a huge redistribution of property. A new generation is coming, particularly Siloviki, be it from the Ministry of Interior, be it from the prosecution office and others, which are really getting huge assets. So this is something that is changing the country, and I do believe at some point the President Putin should decide what is the cost even for him if this war goes forever. To be honest, it's very difficult to talk to somebody that has met the president for the last 1 month. And it's not very clear, basically, where he stands. I was very much impressed by their conversation with President Xi when the microphone was hot and when they start talking about the transfer of organs and the fact that they can live up to 120 years. Because if President Putin believes that he's going to have 20 more years of active life, his view on politics, on war, on the world is totally different than if he believes that he's in mid-70s and he should think about his legacy.
And do you think he thinks that he has another 20 years?
Listen, what I see is that the conversation about the successor has suddenly disappeared from the Russian politics. Because suddenly, I do believe that it means that the very conversation about the successor is perceived as anti-government activity. And this is the major weaknesses of the regime, because we don't have any clear idea about the physical health of the president. By the way, we also don't know what it means that somebody is going to live till 120. We don't know how his mind is going to work. We don't know how relevant his experience is going to be. But
okay,
obviously,
but you don't think that he will really live until 120 years?
It totally doesn't matter what I do think. If he believes in it, probably he can die next year. But if he believes in it, this is changing dramatically how he sees politics and the world.
But is it plausible that he believes that?
I do believe that when you are so high in power for such a long time, many things are plausible. I was always had, before the war, this conversation with colleagues who were very much convinced that Russian elite and President Putin himself is so corrupt that the war cannot start because they are not going to basically strengthen their bank accounts, basically their position in the Western businesses. And my argument always was, you should be very much underpaid assistant professors in some of the Western universities to believe that the leader of a nuclear power thinks in terms of his bank account.
He so obviously wanted to get rich or became rich.
No, he's totally corrupt. There is no doubt about this. The problem is what motivates you. And when I said about the time difference, for example, between Trump and him, there was this joke that there was only 3 persons that he basically consulted when he decided to start the war in Ukraine. And this was Ekaterina the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Peter the Great. But in a way, this is true. Because in a certain way, he believes that the only persons that understand what he's doing are his historical predecessors. I do believe these people are living in a different time. And the thing that really worries me is that when I see to some of the Silicon Valley super rich, and when I see people like Putin and some other of these world leaders, they see the world in the way the Greek gods were seeing the world, what we know from the Greek mythology. They don't see them the same type as the other people. This idea of immortal and mortals, not in a physical sense, starts to exist. Because of the power of technology, because of seeing the world very much, because being 25 years, the president of a great power is changing you dramatically. Everything is different. I was talking to somebody because they're saying, oh, how you have met him, how do you believe he's doing this and that? And I said, do you really believe that if you have met Stalin in 1935, you know how he feels in 1944. Also, the war experience is so transformative. It is so different. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, Russians, because of him. This was a war of choice. We can talk many things, and I do believe that there were many problems with the Western policy towards Russia, but it was a war of choice in the way the Trumps were in Iran. It's a war of choice. It was not that they could not have started this war.
In a major speech in Vienna, you recently said after 1945, making war unthinkable was Europe's greatest achievement. It has now become Europe's greatest vulnerability. But why? Is it really realistic that someone starts a war against Europe, and who?
I do believe that really this was an amazing what happened, particularly after 1989. And this is that ordinary Europeans, they know that there are going to be wars in the world. They could not imagine a major war in Europe. And from this point of view, even Yugoslav wars have been very easily forgotten because they said this was from the past. Yugoslavia was simply this part of Europe who was not really part of Europe when the war started. They have been living in their specific past. But now, first of all, there is a war. And hundreds of thousands of people are dying every day. Secondly, they are on one level Western weapons, because this is the only way for the Ukraine to defend itself. On the other side, you have the permanent talks on the Russian side, that they're in a war with the West, that they're in a war with NATO, that they're going to nuke this or that. And of course, different Europeans feel differently how realistic is the prospect of the war. I'm not sure the Portuguese or Spaniards believe that basically the war is on the door, but go to the Baltic republics and Poland, and they're living like in a pre-war situation. I do believe it was Prime Minister Tusk who said that he feels like in 1939. Is this mean that they're going to be a war? To be honest, we don't know. Probably most of these major conflicts comes because of miscalculation.
But still, could there be such a big miscalculation that Putin, after the war in Ukraine, starts another war against a NATO member?
I don't believe that Putin is interested in a major war. But at the same time, probably he's interested to show to Europeans that NATO is dead and Article 5 does not work. I don't believe that he wants to get Tallinn or Riga. But if he decides to do something to provoke and to show that Europeans are not going to react. For example, Narva, 30 kilometers from the border, you can basically say that something has been done against the Russian populations there, and you just go on 30 kilometers just to show to the Europeans that you should start talking to the Russians because you cannot rely on the Americans. But then countries like Poland, the Baltic republics, even Germany, being afraid and trying to show him that this is not the case, they decide basically to move to Kaliningrad, not responding to Narva, telling him, just to know, if you're going to do this, we're going to respond. And then we're in the escalation spiral that then is out of control of both sides, because in a certain way both sides try to make a point. Don't forget, if he's going to do this and nobody's going to do anything, European Union is going to collapse, because the Baltics and others, they're going to say, you betrayed us, we cannot rely on anything, how we are going to do this or that. And the major idea of such type of an operation is not to control territories, but to create such a level of rupture within the European Union and NATO in order to allow basically Russia's relations with Europe to change. And because Europeans and Americans, they know this, believe that this is going to be really dramatic for Europe, you can expect that there are going to be certain type of reactions. But every reaction creates basically a dynamics of its own. I don't believe that any of the both sides are really interested in a war. Nobody, by the way, can imagine how a war like this is going to look like. But what in my view has changed, and this is dramatic from my point of view, is that this is the major vulnerability of Europe, because suddenly it forces us to see the world totally differently. Before, we're seeing the world very much in a positive sum game. The idea is that interdependence is the major source of security. We're going to trade so much with the Russians that Russians attacking us is attacking themselves. This is what Germans did with the French. This is what they did with the Poles. With the French and the Poles it worked, with the Russians it didn't. But then suddenly, when the war started and when the Russians cut the gas, then you start and all your relationship with others is starting to change. You're asking your question, to whom else we are dependent? And then this is changing your relations with the Chinese, should we want dependencies on them? And now even with the Americans, are we not becoming too dependent? And then suddenly also you realize, and this was the paradox of this war, that Europeans, we managed to convince ourselves that, agreeing with Brecht, that we feel pitiful country that needs heroes. And then comes the war in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians, which were much weaker part, and everybody expected them to be destroyed in 6 weeks, was fighting for themselves, and this was a very spiritual moment. So we start envying the Ukrainians. Before the war, normally you're going to see European flags in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution in 2014. Suddenly you have the Ukrainian flags in Europe, because the idea was they're ready to die for their country. Are we? And then we start basically going with the opinion polls, which said that we are not ready to die for our countries, which, by the way, is, to be honest, total bullshit, because before the war, Ukrainian opinion polls were not different than the German opinion polls. And this is the story of the war. First of all, you don't know what you'll do when the war starts, because this is such a transformative experience. Also, the Ukrainian war could have gone very differently. Imagine that Zelensky has agreed with the Western advice to move to Lviv. Russians were going to take control over Kiev. Probably we're going to be in a totally different situation. So in the moment of a radical change, individuals mattered. Individuals with power matter. Individuals that can capture public imagination matter. We have so much in Europe managed to convince ourselves that everything is about institutions, structure, deep economic reasons. So we are so much surprised to see something that our grandparents knew, that people matter, individuals matter.
So one big vulnerability of Europe is ignoring the possibility of war. But isn't there an even greater vulnerability that despite all the lessons of the 20th century, so many people once again seem to believe in strong men, speaking about personalities, in nationalism and in political extremism, and that our democracies appear to be far less stable internally than we believed for a very long time?
I totally agree with you. There was this famous saying that ships in the ocean do not sink because of the water around them. They sink because of the water inside them. And from this point of view, everything is changing in a way. Nationalism has a different role in European history. Don't forget that liberal nationalism was critically important for creating European democracies.
And but it somehow got out of hand.
So in a strange way, basically, Europe was very much perceiving itself as the post-national project, and this was very important. And by the way, I was always seeing this in the example of my own family. If you go back to places like Bulgaria and go to my grandparents, totally uneducated people, but all of them speak to some extent 2 or 3 languages. They spoke Bulgarian, but they should speak some Turkish because we were part of the Ottoman Empire, and probably basically also some Greek because of trade and so on. And then came the generation of my parents, and in a certain way the nation state discipline. So you should speak just one language, and this is your own language, and it's very much discipline. So for my generation, learning a second or the third language was almost an achievement. And then I see my kids who are speaking 5 or 6 languages, and you don't know from where it comes, why it's so easy. So this opening was incredible. But at the same time, the idea is, where is your home? This sense of home is, in my view, extremely, extremely important. For example, is there a place to return? I was talking to a lot of people voting for the far right in some of the West European countries, and when you talk seriously to people and basically not accusing them of this and that, you start to see that in a certain way, they said, listen, all these migrants who are coming, at least they have a place to go back if they don't like what they see. But where we should go back? Our country is not our country anymore, but there is nowhere to go back. And paradoxically, the far-right parties are telling them, listen, vote for us, and we're a time machine. We're going to bring you back to how your country was before, how it was demographically, how it was economically. And this is a very strong story because we live in a homeless world. Suddenly, as if nobody feels at home. And home is an interesting place because home is a place where you feel that it's a place that you understand, and also you believe that it is a place where you feel understood. And now we are living in a world we are not sure that we understand, and many of us has the feeling that we are totally misunderstood. And I do believe this kind of urge for home created a story that many of the mainstream party became much more nationalistic, and to be honest, even resisting Trump became one of the major sources of it. You can see classical liberal politicians like Mark Carney himself. On the other side, basically, you see a classical European nationalist like the French far right, which said, okay, but probably you cannot get out of Europe because you see what happened in Britain after Brexit. So all this story, what is the new place of nationalism? How to have a nationalism that helps to have a community, but on the other side, not to do what it did in the 20th century, destroying everybody, in my view, is coming again.
But what is actually the appeal of this populist and far-right parties? They promise to be a time machine and to bring back a time when there was a better future.
Yeah.
But how can anyone believe this promise?
Sorry for telling you too many popular films, but there is a popular TV Norwegian series called Beforeigners. Not a great movie, I should confess, but I do believe the idea is great. And this is that suddenly, in today's Norway, boats came, but it was not people coming from other places, but people coming from previous historical times of Norway. So some Vikings are coming, and 19th century Norwegians are coming, and they should be integrated in the society. And my view is that something like this happened to our societies. Our societies are very much kind of strongly divided, also where back in time you want to go. Different people, they have their utopias. Before the utopias was about going ahead in time. Now it's back in time. Many of these utopias are based on nothing. Many of the people who want to go back in the 1950s doesn't have a clue what the 1950s looks like. By the way, the men are the one who are really nostalgic. There was an opinion poll in France asking the women where back in time you want to go, and they said, we don't want to go back in time for very good reasons. Yeah. But I'm saying this, that suddenly this kind of a difference in which, okay, something we're losing. And this is the difference, in my view, between Europeans and, for example, Indians or Brazilians. This kind of change is everywhere. The collapse of the international order is a commonplace. But in some other parts of the world, people are much more attracted by the opportunities. In Europe, we are much more fascinated by what we are losing. And different people believe that they're losing different things. On the right, the normal story is I'm losing my culture, I'm losing social cohesion. To be honest, people of our generation believe we're losing part of our power, being men of a certain generation and position. But also other people, for example, women suddenly said, see what's happening. Issues that have been before perceived as soft issues are coming back, be it abortion, being other things, and so on. So this idea that everybody tries to defend something, not to lose, as a result of it, future disappeared. Future is something that we start to fear, and I have been quite a lot of thinking about this. There is something dramatic about this, because in modernity, the idea was that first there is future. Future is going to be different than what we know the world today. But we're quite positive about this. Different people are positive for different reasons, and I can be very wrong on this, but I do believe one of the reasons Cold War never became hot was both Soviets and Americans believes that future belongs to them. Soviets because of Marxism, which is telling them that capitalism is going to collapse as a result of its contradictions. Americans, and this is a classical containment theory of Kennan, who said, time is on our side. Wait for the contradictions of the communist regimes to come up and you're going to win. But it means that both sides believe that if there's going to be a war, better the war to be tomorrow. Because tomorrow we're going to be in a stronger position. What I'm afraid of the world of today is that many people start to fear that the world of tomorrow, we're going to be in a weaker position. This is a dangerous world. Some people fear, for good reasons, climate. If you read some of the predictions, in year 2100, up to 3 billion people are not going to be able to live where they are living now. Is this prediction right or wrong? I don't know. But this kind of projections are capturing our imagination, and you basically feel totally captured by this. If you see the demographic projections, how many kids are going to be there, how old our societies are going to be. So as a result of it, something dramatically, in my view, changed in democratic politics. We're living only in the time of emergency. If I believe that if certain decisions are not going to be taken today, tomorrow is going to be too long, then losing elections is not an option. Because the charm of democracy was that you can postpone. You can lose today because you know that you can win tomorrow. Certain decisions can be taken today, but it can be also taken tomorrow. And this idea of time suddenly shrank, and suddenly everybody is telling you now or never. And then every election starts to be fought like the last elections. And I'm saying this, I don't believe that Austria is a great example of this. But go to places like the United States, or even in Europe, places like Poland, where you have a genuinely polarized societies. They have the feeling that if something is not going to be done today, be it on climate or reversing migration or doing something, tomorrow is going to be too late.
But on the other hand, you have more and more elections. Like every year, it seems many major democracies almost seem ungovernable. Like Britain's Prime Minister Starmer, who just 1 year ago won a landslide in an election, looks like a dead man walking now. In France, no prime minister seems to last more than a couple of months. In Germany, people are already speculating about the end of Chancellor Merz. And what state is Europe in when the most stable government is in Italy? Yeah. And the prime minister there is a former fascist.
Yeah. No, my feeling is that really seeing not simply the rise of one party and the collapse of others, our regimes are going to be transformed. And on this, there is a good news and bad news. The good news is that democratic regimes have been changing a lot. The major advantage of democracy, comparing the authoritarian regime, is that they have a mechanism for self-correction. You can come with very wrong people in power. Very wrong policies can be put there. But you know what you can do if you're very unhappy. In the authoritarian states, you can be very lucky in a certain period to have certain type of policies that you agree with. But if the things go wrong, you don't know what to do, because having a revolution is a too high cost. And here, the story is that suddenly, people on one level are very unhappy with democracy, but when it comes to the basic story of democracy, that it's a political regime in which the government can lose elections. And when they lose the elections, they leave. People highly appreciated this. Hungary is the greatest example of this. 80% of the people going on the street and voting, and the change is possible. The story is that you have all these changes, but everything is happening so fast that even you don't understand why some governments are doing so badly. I don't believe that the current British Prime Minister was a particularly gifted politician, to put it mildly. at least not the most charismatic I have seen in my life. And I don't believe also that Chancellor Merz is the politician of my dream. But do you really believe that in 1 year you can achieve everything that people expect? One of the things that is happening is that our time horizon has shrank. Part of it is also technology. In a certain way, we start treating the politicians in the way you're treating delivery services. I want my food in 45 minutes, and if basically it's not coming, I start to become nervous. And they don't have time. And because they don't have time, they also start doing stupid things, basically totally overperforming on PR and doing this and that. At some point, they believe that they're very badly treated because their efforts are not taken seriously. Something is happening with the notion of time in our lives and in democratic politics. And this is something that we are not talking much about.
But why did voters become so impatient? Do social media play a role in this?
I do believe it does. And by the way, AI is going to make it even more. Because before, you're sending a letter to somebody, and you're waiting for 2 weeks to go the response back. So this was one rhythm of life. And then you're sending an email and basically any type of a social post, and in 3 minutes you're going the response. But then the governments expect that you're going to ask them something and they're going to reply in 2 months, and then you cannot tolerate it anymore. You start to see this dysfunctionality because your experience of time on market is not the same as your experience of time in politics. And the other thing that happened, and I'm more and more thinking about this, we made our society's individual choice the only source of legitimacy. I have the right to choose everything. I'm choosing where I'm living, I'm choosing what I'm working, I'm choosing whom I'm marrying, I'm choosing my own gender, I'm choosing everything. Everything which is not my personal choice is perceived as being illegitimate. But then I'm choosing so much, but all my choices are reversible. For example, I go and buy a shirt, and the shop is allowing me the next day to return it, not because there is something wrong with the shirt, but because I don't like it anymore. And basically, I can change my gender, but then I can go back. This reversibility, in my view, is creating incredible anxiety. Everything is becoming too easy. And because of it, none of these choices stick. I was thinking even, for example, on migration, how we use on the level of language. In English language, we see crossing the border. Crossing comes from cross. This is not something which is easy. It is not easy for somebody who is making this decision. It is not easy for the other side. Everything is happening very easy. Very easily, people for weeks are becoming billionaires. They're buying some stocks which nobody has heard about. Suddenly, they're billionaires. Then suddenly, men becoming women, the other way around. And everything is reversible, and everything is kind of too easy. I had the feeling that we should really reconsider the idea of time and this idea of commitment to our choices. We choose so much that none of the choices means much anymore. And this is why voting for a certain party becomes like buying a shirt. I buy it, I don't like it anymore, I go back. You voted with a 53%, and then in 3 months, without something really happening, you see that half of your voters are not with you anymore. This kind of disloyalty is becoming the major kind of a characteristics of our attitude towards life. And this is very difficult for anybody who is in the business of representation, because representation is based on certain loyalty, and everything starts to become much easier. Divorcing is much easier, leaving your party is much easier, leaving your country is much easier. And on one level, this is a liberating and emancipating spirit. On the other, it creates this anxiety that we talk about, and that make democratic politics so hectic and in a certain way so dissatisfying.
But can democracy actually deal with that? Because this trend you are describing seems not reversible. But still, politics is a very complex business, and complex decisions take time. And even if you have the decision, it takes time for the consequences. So how can democracy work in that kind of environment?
I'm not sure that I know the answers. First of all, I do believe that one dramatic thing happened, and we all are suffering of it. There was a time, and not so long ago, the logic of the market was not the same as the logic of politics, and the logic of politics was not the same as logic of culture. I do believe we should try to reinvent the distinction between politics and other fields of life. We cannot act on the field of politics in the same way we act on the market level. You are totally right. If you have a government that have been in power for 6 months, and if they have not done something which is dramatically wrong, you even cannot judge them, because the result of their policy choices are going to be seen in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years. The only thing that politicians can produce very fast is social posts, videos. And this is the Trump effect. Basically, we are commenting very much the social posts of President Trump. We are not commenting many of his policies. And the social posts are changing dramatically. And as a result of it, basically, you're losing any accountability of the politicians, because we are not talking about what was the impact of the tariffs. Because every day, as if the world is created anew, there is a kind of a new big issue, there is a new war or something like this. And this makes me very, very nervous. Do authoritarian regimes doing better with this? To be honest, I don't know. China is a very special case for many reasons. But this pressure of time, this acceleration, goes there too. And even some of the places which till yesterday was the new Switzerlands of the world. Everybody is going to say the Gulf states, particularly Emirates. And overnight you understand how vulnerable they are. How all this idea of stability that have been created for the last 20, 30 years has collapsed overnight. So suddenly we are living in a world which, in my view, resembles 1930s in one aspect. There is nowhere to go. Suddenly you don't know where is the stable place. There, at least you believe that you can go to the United States. But now the United States is as hectic and unpredictable as anybody else. If you try to decide where you want to go to believe that you can avoid some kind of a catastrophe that you feel, where you'll go?
New Zealand is always an option.
New Zealand is a great option because very few of us have been there.
It's very far away from everywhere. So, but speaking about Donald Trump, and we have to talk about him, right after his re-election, you said that his second presidency would be fundamentally different from the first and much more radical. And very obviously you were right. But why were you so certain?
This is exactly about the experience. In a strange way, this is where I can claim that my personal experience and of my generation of East Europeans of 1989 helps us. Because in a certain way, when you see a revolution, you recognize it. Westerners were very much shocked by what Trump was doing in the beginning of the second term because they didn't understand what he was doing. In Eastern Europe, we were shocked because we had the feeling that we know what he was doing. Basically, it was a regime change. He had a total mistrust in the way this country was functioning. He really believes that he should go for a change. And one of the most important things about the change is when, for example, you appoint somebody, in the revolutionary time, the most important is not his competence, but his loyalty. And even more, you're going to put somebody who should not be too competent because your biggest fear is that he's going to be co-opted by the system. I have seen this in the early 1990s in Bulgaria. So for me, America very much resembled something that I have seen and experienced. And because then we have been on the other side, also I knew some of the assumptions. For example, in this kind of a revolutionary regimes, you're overzealous. You change your views very fast. You're very much afraid how the others are looking at you because the revolutionary regimes are famous for cannibalism. Nobody can feel secure. And from this point of view, Trump was great. And this was his vegetarian version of revolutionary violence, where, of course, nobody is killed, but everybody can lose power immediately. And this was one of the things that basically, in my view, European leaders were totally wrong when they were trying to imagine the second Trump administration, because they were imagining Trump 2 like Trump 1. But it was not the case, because Trump 1 was a prime minister of a coalition government. He was in power together with the traditional Republicans. He was very much constrained, and he hated this constraint. One of the major reasons why he was going, at least in the beginning, so much pro-Putin was that you didn't allow me the previous time to do it. I'm going to show you that now I can do what I want. But the paradox of this is, and this is a classical Machiavelli, if a leader can do anything that he wants, he's not overpowerful. He's simply mad. Because power comes from constraints. And this is why I do believe we're in all this period in which he's all the time trying to show that he's beyond the convention. On the other side, the courts, probably if he's going to lose the midterm elections, also the Congress, the Senate, will try to push him to show that this is not the case. And all this is changing, and this is a powerful country. On the other side, we're focused on Trump, but I have been part of this European Council of Foreign Relations global polling, and I saw something that was very interesting. When Trump came to power, Europeans and South Koreans were very unhappy because we knew his view on allies, we knew that he didn't trust alliances, but Indians, Brazilians, South Africans, they believed that Trump coming is going to be better for their country, better for the world peace. They were quite positive. 1 year later, some of them lost their positivity, but something much more important happened. Suddenly, in every single country that we have been polling, 11 countries in Europe, 10 big countries outside of Europe, everybody believes that in the next 10 years, China is going to be more powerful than it is now. And, which is much more interesting, everybody believes that their relations with China are going to be better than now. What Trump achieved in this first 1.5 years is that not simply that China looks better, but suddenly nobody fears China. This is the thing that probably for me is the most important. One of the biggest problems of Europeans was that when 1989 happened, for us 1989 was what happened in Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall, Eastern Europe. But Kissinger years ago said that the disintegration of the Soviet Union in historical terms is going to be more important than the unification of Germany. And the rise of China and India is going to be more important than the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So if you're now looking back, we know that what happened in Tiananmen in 1989 could turn to be more important than what happened in Berlin in 1989. And there are other things that was happening in 1989 that we didn't see back then and we start to seeing now. For example, in this period, 1989-1992, a huge group of Soviet Jews went to Israel and basically changed the population. There was 25% of the population have been the new arrivals, which dramatically changed Israeli politics. So you're never going to understand the shift in the Israeli politics and policies if you're not going to take care of this major shift that happened in the long 1989. So now when we see Trump, we should try to be also very important to see what else is happening in other places. Because in 10 years, it can turn out that some of these developments are going to be more critical for understanding the world than simply what Trump has done.
Do you have any idea what Donald Trump wants, apart from being a limitless, powerful president?
To be absolutely honest, I don't know that he's a person that has strategic goals. He has a very strong instinct. He, by the way, has obviously incredible political talent. The way he managed to basically make the world being interested in him every single day, he behaves as a TV celebrity. In a certain way, he's in a competition with everybody, that he's going to capture the attention of everybody. So you should understand him very much thinking in terms of a TV ratings. Then it's a kind of a political legacy.
So it's all a huge show?
It is a show, but when we say show, we say that it's not interesting. He simply believes that this is how time looks. People like to call him nationalist. Listen, nationalists normally are interested in history. They are very much relating to certain previous leaders. We don't have this with Trump. There is not a single American president with whom he feels a kind of a particularly genuine bond, to whom he's always referring and so on. I don't believe that even he's so much interested in what is going to come after him.
Apart from an arch in Washington and maybe his head on Mount Rushmore and a banknote with his face on it.
But he enjoys this. Listen, normally you expect this to be done when you're not here anymore. You expect that when you die, people are going to call Kennedy Center, Kennedy Trump Center. But he so much distrusts his successors that he wants everything to be done while he's still in power. This is a certain type of political narcissism, and his own individual is his own universe. And from this point of view, he's very difficult than the traditional nationalists, which are living in this long time. But what he wants to be there. He wants everybody to love him. He's everybody to be able to basically to please him. People said that in personal conversation, he could be extremely charming. And also, there is something interesting about him. He's very revengeful, but he's ready very much to change the relations. People who he hated yesterday suddenly becoming best friends. So every new series of the film gives you a new option. And I do believe this makes him very different. And this is why it's so difficult for the world to adjust to him, and it's so difficult for the American society to adjust for him. And for Europeans, we do not have a chance, because his idea of time is not institutional. So, for example, he said, are you to support us on this or that? For the Europeans, even if we decide to support him, it's going to take us 2 weeks because we should discuss and there should be institutional decision. In 2 weeks, he has forgotten what he has asked for. So as a result of it, he's permanently disappointed because nobody can be in his tempo, in basically his time zone.
He still has 2.5 years left in office. What happens after that? Will these 4 years in hindsight be seen like as a freak episode in American history and everything goes back to normal, like to the default position of a liberal democracy? Or will Trump have changed the United States permanently? Or will he even try to remain president forever?
I don't believe. He's an old man, and there is one thing that you cannot disqualify it, and this is age. And in a certain way, I can imagine, paradoxically, this is going to be the Biden's revenge, because Biden lost, showing to the Americans that there's a certain age which does not fit for the presidency. And of course, Trump very much benefited from this. And while he's a highly energetic person, you more and more start to see his age. And I do believe this is going to affect people. There are many things I don't know in the world. But one thing that I believe I know is that world is not going to go back where it was. After the first Trump, we can live with the illusion that this was just an aberration. This is a major radical change. It's going to be a different society. It's not only Trump, it's technology, it's economy, it's demography. Our societies are going to look very different. We're living in a society where in 20, 30 years, people who are older than 50 are going to be the majority. How this is going to change our democracies? How you're going to change the democracy if you believe that many of the people who are going to be older are going to be also people who do not have children? How this is going to affect the way you see the future, the way basically you plan your life? How this is going to affect our lives, the fact that we're living much longer, and some of the last years of our life, people basically can have a dementia and certain things which is going to be much more usual than they are now. I do believe that this radical change comes, and Trump is one of the symbols of all this. He's not the reason for this. He's, of course, too powerful to be neglected. He contributed a lot to the anxieties in which we're living. But the way we're living is going to change. For example, the way we're getting information already has changed dramatically. And also the AI is also going to change a lot. For example, imagine that our kids are coming to us and start asking what we should study. And before, when you don't know what you should tell to your kids, you said, listen, at least you can become a lawyer or accountant to be sure that you're going to have a job. And now the projections tell you that around 74% of all accountant jobs in the United States are going to be lost in the next 10 years. And probably 40% of all lawyer jobs. Suddenly also what is happening is that the relations between generations are changing. Suddenly we're not sure anymore that we can give any advices to our kids about how the next world is going to look like, because it is going to be so different than the one that we have. And plus some of the major moral questions that, honestly speaking, I do believe that we have neglected for the last 25, 30 years are coming back. Was it not interesting that the institution which basically most powerfully addressed the AI as a moral issue was the Vatican? where these AI people should go to ask for moral advice, where to stop and can you stop it if AI has become so much part of the national security and Americans and Chinese and Russians and everybody else is doing this. So in my view, all this is a new questions. And when you're asking me what's going to change and not change, on this I have a very strong view. I do believe that a major change comes not when we change the answers to the old questions, but when the new questions are coming. This is when one kind of an era is changing another era. The questions that we have been asking in 1945 were not the same that we have been asking in 1920s or 1930s.
What you just said reminds me of Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday, in which he writes that after the First World War, suddenly age and experience had no value anymore. Old people with their long beards, they were no longer idealized, and younger politicians emerged. Is this a similar situation?
It is an interesting situation because on one level it's totally true. Basically, the experience of these young people is very different. They have many advantages when it comes to the way they deal with social media or AI and so on. They're going to be a generation that is going to be socialized by this. And don't forget, all these young people who are going to have their AI boyfriend or girlfriend, their idea of intimacy is going to be totally different.
But the same will happen to very old people who are not lonely anymore.
Yeah, but then the story is, if we're still democracies, the young people has one major difference with the generation of about which Zweig was talking. They're small cohorts. They don't have the numbers. When they go to the ballot box, they don't have the numbers basically to change the country in the way they want, for good or for bad. Secondly, after World War I, there was a totally new generation, and most of the experience was the war experience. That's why I never basically liked very much when people said we're back in the 1920s or 1930s. We're not back, because our societies back then have been populated by ex-soldiers. From this point of view, this great book, and after that also the TV series M, The Son of the Century, about Mussolini is great. You have a generation that came from the most vertical structure existing, the army, and then ended up in a society without structure. And the result is what we saw. Here it's different, but the relations between the generations changed dramatically. For example, people like to talk a lot about young men and women without children. For me, the real drama is grandparents without grandchildren. This was really very important for the way people try to imagine the world. My mother is never going to ask herself the question how the world is going to look in 30 years. People don't ask these questions. But how the world in which my grandchildren are going to live is a question that she's asking herself all the time. And this is why we managed to make the future more present in the present. If there are people who are not asking these questions, and also social media made possible that young people mostly talking between themselves. I remember I'm coming back home, there was no phones, there was not this, there was not that, and you're talking to your grandparents and you're asking questions, and because they're asking questions, they remember, and they are telling stories. Nobody's asking them questions, they don't remember anymore.
You have a daughter who grew up in Vienna and now in her mid-20s lives in England, and she grew up in a world shaped by 9/11, then the financial crisis, the euro crisis, the refugee crisis, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, inflation, October 7th, the war in Gaza, Donald Trump, and above all, the climate crisis and AI. What do you tell your daughter when she asks you what the future will look like?
It's a great question. I have a daughter, I have a son who is 17. And by the way, I'm going to probably tell different things to my daughter and to my son. Because one of the interesting stories in this generation is how different the women and young men are seeing the world. This is a generation which is particularly more divided. The only thing that I'm going to tell you, I don't know how the world is going to look like. But the worst in the world like this is to lose your curiosity. Be curious and try to understand the world, because it's going to be, in my view, critically important. And from this point of view, I'm very much more optimistic than you should expect from me. You can like or dislike these younger generations, but they have a level of curiosity which reassures me. I very much hated this kind of a toxic optimism, particularly politicians. They feel obliged to tell people that they're optimistic about this and that. I also don't like particularly pessimism, because people believe that they know how the world is going to look like, both optimists and pessimists. My daughter, my son, they know that they're going to live in a world different than ours. I'm not sure that they like necessarily the world that they see, but the very fact that they know that they're living in a different world already for me is a good sign.
You like to quote a remark by Václav Havel about hope and optimism. What is it about this remark that appeals so much to you?
Listen, we don't know the future. At least I don't know the future. But Havel was saying the difference between being hopeful and being optimistic is being hopeful. You're doing what you believe is right. And we are doing this not because you know what's going to happen, but because this is how you feel and this is what you should believe is going to be done. And there is one another kind of a quote and like very much, and this is by Albert Hirschman, the very genius social scientist of the generation of the 1930s, who said, "My task in the world was to prove Hamlet wrong, which means that you can have doubts and act at the same time." For me, this was always very important. We can have questions. We cannot be sure. It does not mean that we can do nothing.
Ivan Krastev, thank you so much.
Thank you.